I'm back to talk about more movies, and let's start off with American Pie because I don't know. American Pie is a fairly consistent sex comedy movie series, because most sex comedies they have pretty mixed movie series because most of the time the sequels are either made with very little effort or just really cheaply made. But not in the case of American Pie. Each of these movies do have a consistent quality. Of course, some are better than others, but in terms of the quality for this genre, it's really consistent. So let's start off with the first American Pie, which is a total classic, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It has one of the funniest scenes in the history of cinema, the pie scene. If you've seen the movie before, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the pie scene. It's not just the joke itself that's really funny, but the way that the movie executes that joke. It sets up a lot of these little things, and then you think that they are unconnected, but the movie finds a way to connect all these little setups together to form a big joke, and that big joke is what really leads to the kind of gut-busting reaction from the audience. And I laughed for 2 days at that pie scene. Really, 2 days. I laughed 2 days. I don't think there's another joke that I laughed for that long in a movie. But besides the jokes, it's also about the characters. It's only because of how strong and how relatable these characters are that we get 4 movies in this series. If the characters are like total garbage, we won't even get a sequel. But these characters, they all have their own personality, they have their own storylines, and the movie goes between all 4 of these characters' different storylines. And all of their storylines are equally as interesting. So the movie, there's never a dull moment in the movie because each of these characters have very unique stories that are also really interesting. Oh, then there's also Stifler, which is one of the best supporting characters of all time. And the performances too, I have to talk about that. The comedic performances by all of these people are so great since a lot of them at that time were fairly inexperienced actors. So considering that, they are really good in this movie. Their comedic performances are really, really good. American Pie is a total classic, great performances, a very great way of setting up jokes as well, that leads to really, really funny payoffs. And if you haven't seen this movie yet, watch it. If not for the jokes, watch it for the characters, because the characters are just as good, and you're gonna feel a connection to these characters, even though they are very awkward and cringeworthy characters. But you can take your eyes off them because maybe humans are just fascinated by awkwardness in general. Maybe that's why you're watching me right now. So the next movie is American Pie 2. This movie is dirtier than the last one. It's a little bit different, but at the same time there's a lot of similarities. The difference obviously is in the plot. The plot is different now. It shows kind of a growth for the characters. The last movie had the characters graduating, so now they're going on a trip, like a sort of a graduation trip. And it's a very natural growth for the characters. So I really liked that. And also I liked how each of these characters' stories continue to grow as well. All these characters still had really interesting storylines. Not as interesting as the first one, but still really interesting. And if you're a fan of the first American Pie, you should definitely watch this movie. It's dirtier, and in some ways it's also funnier than the original movie. It may not have the heart of the original movie, but it definitely has the laughs of the original movie. Now moving on to American Wedding, which is the third American Pie movie. They're not going with American Pie 3 this time, they're going with American Wedding. And this one is my least favorite out of the 4 movies because one of the characters from the original film, there's the 4 guys. One of the guys is absent in this film, which is pretty bad since we have already kind of grown a connection with these characters after watching 2 of their movies. And now with this character absent, that connection is a little bit broken, I would say, even though the other 3 characters are still there. Still, even with the other 3 characters there, the movie chooses to focus exclusively on just one character, and the other two characters are just pushed to the sideline. So that makes the movie actually really dull because, truth be told, the first American Pie movie, the only reason the story worked was because there were four stories. But the thing about all four of these stories is that none of them could work on their own. They all needed each other. The movie could not work with just one story. It had to work with four stories. But in this movie, American Wedding, it went with only one story, and you see just how weak this story actually is, and how this movie really requires multiple storylines to kind of keep the interest going. And by the time this movie nears its like, third act, it becomes really boring. I would just say that. It has one really funny sequence that uses the same technique that American Pie 1 and 2 uses, the same technique of putting up a lot of little small jokes here and there and then connecting all of these small jokes together. But that only happens once, which compared to the first two movies is really little. And the other jokes in this movie just not that funny. Only that one joke that used that technique is funny. And besides, let's talk about Stifler. I don't understand why Stifler has an extended dancing sequence in his movie. Like that dancing sequence goes on forever. I don't know why. Maybe it's because Sean William Scott is a great dancer. The movie wants to show off his dancing skills. I don't know. Okay, just why? Why? American Reunion is the fourth American Pie movie. And this is definitely a step up from American Wedding. Finally, they go back to the kind of format of having four different storylines between four different characters, but this time they actually gave Stifler a very unique storyline as well. So there are 5 characters and 5 storylines this time. And a lot of this movie is just fan service, to be honest. But as a fan, they did give me good service, so I'm not gonna sit here and tell you the movie's bad, because if you're a fan, you're gonna enjoy this movie. But just make sure this isn't your first movie. Don't let American Reunion be your first experience to this series. Always start with the first one when it comes to American Pie. But after you've seen the first 2 American Pie movies and you want more, sure, you could go ahead and watch American Reunion. It really feels like a nostalgic trip, and a lot of times it could rely a little bit too much on nostalgia and not really have an identity of its own. But that isn't really a problem, since this is a movie that's already entering its 4th installment, and it really isn't that high of a concept of a movie as well. So it's enjoyable enough. American Reunion is definitely surprisingly enjoyable for me, since I wasn't really expecting much, since the last movie was American Wedding. But this one returns to its roots, and it returned to the same technique that they used in the first 2 movies of telling jokes, and used that technique much more often than American Wedding did. And the result of going back to its roots is making a movie that feels a lot more like the first 2 movies. So in conclusion, I think that you should just start with the first American Pie movie, and if you really like that, go to the second one. And if you really like the first 2 movies, watch the 4th one, American Reunion. Now, if you're at this stage and maybe you want to try to complete the series, you're that kind of guy who wants to complete every series, then maybe you could check out American Wedding. It's not really that bad, considering it is a sequel to a sex comedy, but compared to the other American Pie movies, it's not as good.